à-bas-le-ciel.
We don't have a lot to offer. We're not the new iPhone 10 or something. Veganism is not a technology that's offering to make your life easier. It's an ethical burden with very real political demands on your time and very uncertain, very dubious, future positive outcomes.
And this is kind of a bell curve with people on one end, the early adopters on one end, and the laggards on the other end. And this bell curve is something that we see all the time, especially with technological innovation and adaptation to new technologies, but we see it with all kinds of innovations. It doesn't have to be a scientific innovation necessarily. It doesn't have to be a technological innovation. This can also be changes in the way that we live. And they tend to follow a very predictable pattern, and that's why we see this curve everywhere. But most of us are still in that early 2.5% range. And that's kind of where veganism is at this point. And we want to think about what can happen to make that take off.
The type of failure we have to plan for is precisely that of being an ethically defined minority over the long term, of forming, of organizing effective modes of lobbying, effective ways of influencing the government. If long-term, we may never do better than 2%, we may never do better than 1% in terms of people who are ethically motivated vegans. How to be effective, how to influence the future course of society, knowing that in a lot of ways we have less growth potential than some of these pathetic cult groups, transcendental meditation groups, or Scientology or something like this, because fundamentally we have a lot less to offer people. Yes, aside from saving the planet. What is the situation in Israel and what is the situation in Taiwan? So these are, I think, the two unique, important examples of societies that have a large percentage of people who've become vegan. I don't think we could look at the example of Israel and say that these gains, this expansion of veganism, could be transferred from Israel to Egypt next door. Right away, if you say, so if this is the percentage of people who are vegan in Israel, don't you think in the next 5 years Egypt is going to catch up? Well, do you or don't you? How about Syria on the other border? Right away, just asking that question, we stop and think, actually there are a lot of really unique, really peculiar factors about Israel. Now, meanwhile, in Taiwan, we're talking about a mixed Buddhist, Confucian, Chinese culture, but a culture where Buddhism is one major religious voice among many. Taiwan has I think, the largest and most vibrant vegan community, or vegan communities, plural, in the world. Okay, I think they're actually ahead of Israel. However, do you think that any of the gains made in Taiwan could be transferred to the Philippines? No chance. The Philippines is divided between Catholics and Muslims at this point, right? Those are the next islands south. Look at a map. It's not that far. You can say, yeah, such a large percentage of people in Taiwan have become vegan. And, and this is the early adopter curve. This is the thin edge. So therefore, the next stop is the Philippines, right? This will take off. This will take off in all of Southeast Asia. You've got to be joking. I think of that from the perspective of someone who sees veganism as a failure, and as someone that's going to continue to fail, or we're going to continue to be a small, despised minority within Western society. 2% is optimistic, I think. But we're a small, despised minority that happens to be right about some of these issues, and where we can lobby, we can have our voices heard in a Western, pluralistic, democratic society. We can have big impacts.
À-bas-le-ciel.
So just a couple of days ago, my girlfriend and I watched a Gary Francione video that's exactly the same as all the other Gary Francione videos. I mean, no shade, no hatred, but I turned on this video and I was fast forwarding through it wondering, is this exactly the same as every other lecture I've heard from Gary Francione or not? And it was basically the same. Gary Francione is a leader in the vegan movement, in case you guys don't know, a major leader. And when he got to this point, I commented to my girlfriend while we were watching it, one aspect of this guy's philosophy that's really kind of sweet and naive and touching is that he still just really believes in veganism being spread one at a time, person to person. And he got to this point in the lecture where he just optimistically says to the audience, it's a Canadian audience, he says, well, let's say there are 40,000 vegans in Canada this year. If just one of you goes out and converts a friend to veganism this year, if every one of us goes out and converts one more person to vegan, the next year there will be 80,000 vegans. The next year, 160,000. And he actually projected on the screen getting to millions and then getting to be the vast majority of Canadians within so many years. So this kind of optimistic thinking, we both laughed out loud. I mean, it's not really ha-ha funny, but we both laughed hearing Francione say this. This kind of optimistic thinking is common to all ideologies and to all religions, especially new religions. I mean, the Catholic Church may not think they have the power to double the number of Catholics in a year, whereas new cult groups do, again and again. And I lived through this between, say, 1965 and 1985. Hinduism within the United States, by which I mean specifically white people converting to Hinduism, was a big story. It was on the cover of Time magazine. It was at every airport. There used to be all these jokes from stand-up comedians about being hassled by white Hindus at the airport, white people who converted to Hinduism, trying to get you also to convert to Hinduism. And the Transcendental Meditation groups, the Hare Krishnas, there were a number of different neo-Hindu groups within the United States doing this. And they did. I mean, if you have this preconceived notion that new technologies, new cultural movements, new ideas go through these early adopter phases, they also thought of themselves as being optimistically in this early adopter phase. So they were the first few percentages of the population to convert in what was going to be a mass movement. And it wasn't. It failed, but it's really important to say, I've said this on my YouTube channel maybe closer to 2 years ago, it's really important to recognize that they actually got much further than veganism has gotten to date. It's definitely in the United States. The Osho followers formally incorporated their own city in Oregon. So you may not know this story. There is some hilarious and chilling anecdotes in that. You can find documentaries about this within YouTube. So they called it Rajneeshpuram. So, the city of Rajneesh is a metonym for Osho. They're one of the many names used by this guy, Osho, whom they were devotees of. And they did actually get to the kind of critical mass and level of organization and level of affluence to start doing genuine community building activities within the United States, more than just creating temples or what have you. They really did build communities and incorporate those cities. Now, I'm not presuming that is the desired modus operandi of vegans. We see some claiming they're going to do it, though. We were just looking at the new manifesto from Direct Action Everywhere, their Compassionate Cities programs. It comes pretty close to Rajneeshpuram. I mean, a lot of their stuff is pretty culty, but a lot of what they're calling for, establishing alternate communities with alternate transportation systems and so on. There's a lot to be read into the vagueness of their claims and their promises. But in terms of this imaginary slope that you're going to go from early adopter to mass market, similar to the pattern seen by some technologies, it was easy for white Hindus in America to delude themselves into thinking that they were the early adopters going up this slope and this was going to become a mass phenomenon, the Hinduization of America. And from their perspective, why not? From their perspective, they have a technology that fundamentally makes their lives better, especially the people who believe in transcendental meditation. They do believe in it as a technology. They do market it as a technology. And vegans, likewise, I think we do deserve to be criticized. We may regard what we're doing as a new technology that makes other technologies obsolete, but it's not. There's an etic versus emic perception here. From a meat eater's perspective, there is no sense in which broccoli makes beef obsolete. I mean, I may feel that way. I may argue that to you passionately, but there's no sense in which tofu is going to make beef obsolete as on a technological level. In some ways, yes, the progress of veganism can be compared to technological progress, and in some ways it can't. In some ways, it has to be compared to a grubby little cult like the followers of Osho, who set up this crappy city, set up their cult out in Oregon, and who, by the way, eventually got involved in some illegal terrorist activities and what have you. There's a whole things got as is so regularly the case with cult groups. Things got out of control, and arrests were made, and the community was more or less broken up. And today, that community is a Christian-run like Bible camp. So you're missing out on the facial reactions from my girlfriend here. But anyway, it's sort of like a day camp for Christians because they built up all these facilities and they ended up selling the property. All right, to whoever could pay the market price. Anyway, yeah. So there are a lot of false assumptions here I want to challenge. So I want to say within anthropology, the diffusionist model that ModVegan is referring to here has been totally discredited. It's not just unfashionable, it has been discredited. And it's interesting that those concepts really originated in the 1960s, looking primarily at anthropological and agricultural abstractions, how technology was adopted, new farming technology was adopted, this kind of thing. But today we think of this idea, this growth curve, the early adopter phase and then mass market phase, and so on, primarily in terms of digital technology, and that is very misleading. Now, almost nothing can be compared to digital technology. This came up in my book review of the book that was called Half Earth. I'm sorry, I forget the author's name. You can find that in the book review playlist. But that's an interesting book, and among the kind of dangerous delusions is that this guy presents the case that the whole economy is going to behave like the digital economy, like the computer economy, the same way that you could have doubling and quadrupling of productivity without using more resources, while actually using fewer resources, less resources, being more efficient, that in the same way the whole human economy was going to behave this way, and therefore we would need less and less land use and so on. Now, of course, hilariously, the switching to a vegan diet is one of the exceptions to this. Switching to a vegan diet does make us more efficient. We use far less land, far less water, etc. But no, so we're doing this on a wooden table. If you want to manufacture wooden tables, doesn't matter if you're using wood from Indonesia or wood from Canada or something, the advent of computer technology, it may make the design process more efficient. It may make sanding the table more efficient or something, but there's no sense in which you can say, oh, we're going to use half as much wood and make twice as many tables next year thanks to digital technology. It does not work that way. In a very meaningful sense, nothing operates the way digital technology does. And this is an important point. In terms of this curve of mass adoption of technology, the functions achieved by a computer, this word computer is already a little misleadingly vague, those changed fundamentally from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. There was a time when, and I can remember this, cool people looked down their noses at computers as being just for nerds. Well, what did computers do at that time? What were the actual functions? What were the things you could achieve with a computer? And then 10 years later, the computer was taking over the functions that were formerly done by, well, a typewriter, obviously. But there was an early stage when you couldn't even do that in a computer, when you could do mathematical operations and so on. But word processing was really not possible on a computer in the early days. So it was taking over the functions of what used to be a typewriter, taking over the functions of what used to be a telephone, and then a big one, it took over the functions of what used to be a VCR. You could play movies on a computer. So you can do this chart of the population adopting computers. But the early adopters were using computers for functions that are fundamentally different from and fundamentally alien to what the mass market used them for. So, the average person today owns a computer and they use it to watch movies, use Skype, make phone calls to their friends, for all social media applications or what have you. However, if you say, oh, this is a situation where the early adopters, people who were doing, advanced mathematics on a computer, for example, the sending a man to the moon, the early space exploration, they had these incredibly primitive computers that they relied on for complex mathematics that human lives depended on. It's amazing what they could do. But, if you think about who is using a computer for those functions, the functions a computer could do in the period of, let's say, 1975 to 1980, that's still an incredibly small part of the population. And it's really misleading to look at this mass adoption because, in a sense, you can say it's the same technology, but it's the same technology being used for fundamentally different things. Veganism is not like that. And again, I say maybe in a very meaningful sense, nothing else is like that. Maybe these are unique properties of computers and no other technology. Now, again, diffusionism was really discredited within contemporary anthropology. It's an outmoded and now much despised model. But it did lead people to think in terms of things like the spread of religious ideology, a new religion or what have you, in these terms, in these diffusionist terms, as if this was a new technology being adopted by people. And again, I can say to some extent there's some truth to that, but it's really, this is why it became unfashionable. Look at the spread of Islam within Indonesia. do you really want to describe this as a new technology being appropriated by people? Doesn't that remove completely the human tragedy of what happened as these people lost their own culture and lost a lot of their independence and freedom of thought and sexual freedom and this complete transformation of the culture? Whether you're talking about Northern Africa, the spread of Islam in Northern Africa, or the spread of Islam in Indonesia, yes, you can try to code it in these, I don't know what to say, to represent this as if the spread of an idea is people adopting a technology, but it is, I think, deeply dishonest and deeply misleading. And obviously, ModVegan has only good intentions here, but likewise, I would say it's deeply dishonest and misleading to talk about veganism this way. Right? Now, okay, come back to point one, we might as well here. Gary Francione and him talking about doubling and doubling how many people are vegan, which again, an ideological Hindu could have said back in 1965, back when the Beatles briefly got involved with Hinduism. I mean, that was big news. The Beatles were on the cover of every magazine, meditating and wearing flower garlands and going to India. It seemed like Hinduism was really going to be hip in the white Western world, about 65 to 85, right? Think about any group of people you know. I mean, you can think about your own family, but that's misleading. I've just been a student at University of Victoria in British Columbia, and I knew, this came up earlier, I actually knew a lot of my classmates better than Melissa did. Melissa had classrooms of 400 people or something, but I really did have pretty small classes where I knew a lot of the people. If I just visualize one of those classrooms, from when I was a university student, and then I really think about those people who, I have some face-to-face knowledge of, can I imagine 50% of that class becoming vegan within the next 10 years? There's that guy, there's the guy. And if I'm just being honest with myself, if I just think about those people I know, maybe one or two of them would become vegan. But even that would be a surprise. And no, I can't imagine this whole classroom becoming vegan. I can't imagine half of them becoming vegan. And all of them have spent a couple of years talking to me, and some of them looking at my YouTube channel or what have you. It's not a new idea out in British Columbia and living in a city where veganism is visible. I mean, this kind of human calculus is very humbling, I think, to these ideological claims. I don't believe my own family members are going to become vegan, but I mean, that can be misleading. You may be related to people who have a lot in common with you, so maybe within your own family you do feel a lot of your relatives, can become vegan. You're very optimistic that way. But whether you think about your coworkers at the workplace or people who happen to be assigned to the same class with you in high school, or people who happen to be assigned to the same class to you in university, I was sitting in university classrooms with people who were doing Asian studies. These were disproportionately people who were very familiar with the history, culture, and languages of Asia, people who are studying Buddhism and Hinduism and things like that, a few. These were, if anything, you might think I'd have a ludicrously optimistic view of this based on just who was in the classroom with me. But I don't. I look at them, just in my own mind's eye, looking back at that classroom of people I study with, I don't even know if there's one person in that classroom who has the potential to become vegan. And computer technology is not like that. Converting to Islam is not like that. I mean, it may sound strange to say they don't have what it takes, to be vegan, but that's really what I mean. I'm really being sincere in saying that. So as misleading as it is, again, if you were living in the United States from 1965 to 1985, even in Australia, I've heard about these groups, the transcendental meditation groups in Australia, where they thought they were taking over Australia because they were getting white people to convert and donate money. This is another big factor that an advantage that religions have over veganism is the donation side of the game, because you can get huge donations just by promising people they go to heaven after they die. Veganism doesn't have that edge. All right? We only promise you have a 70% lower chance of getting a heart attack, getting cancer, etc. But after you die, that's your problem. We can't help you out. But anyway, it was easy for people inside those cult groups to think this is growing exponentially, or this is going through an early adopter phase, and then the chart is we're going to take over the whole mass market. Another example, sometimes you hear these things from people who are racist, sometimes not, from people who are just sincerely concerned. In Canada, all the time, I hear from people that they think the Chinese are taking over Canada. All right? Now, sorry, I'm currently living in China. This is being recorded in China. I speak enough Chinese. I've now studied the Chinese language for several years. I like Chinese people. This is not my point. Why do some white Canadians perceive this? Because they see Chinese restaurants on the streets. I mean, Chinese restaurants, I've mentioned this in my manifesto video. What's the video called? I forget. On community. My manifesto video on community. One of the sort of most low-key but durable and impactful forms of activism for gay rights and for veganism and for Chinese food is just having permanent institutions there. When you live in a city that has permanent gay nightclubs that lets people know, homosexuals are a permanent part of this community. It just says, hey, we have a gay community, or we have a significant number of people who are gay. This isn't a fad. This isn't something that's going to disappear. This is also true of Chinese restaurants. Now, if you live in a city like Victoria, BC, Canada, or Toronto, or Montreal, or what have you, some people they see Chinese restaurants everywhere and they think, wow, the Chinese are taking over. Well, the Chinese are taking over what? Are the Chinese taking over minimum wage jobs that have to compete with McDonald's? Even then, I would only say maybe. I think if you look at the market fundamentals, I don't think it's easy at all for Chinese restaurants to compete with McDonald's and Chipotle and to provide their people with wages and retirement benefits and what have you. I think that's a really tough racket. I think it'd be really easy to say maybe the number of Chinese restaurants hits a peak and then a lot of them are going out of business. Where I just was, there were a lot of empty Chinese restaurants in Victoria, BC. It looks like something to me that peaked in about 1992 and now a lot of them are going out of business. But the fact that there are, even if you live in a city that's full of vibrant, economically successful Chinese restaurants that are paying their employees minimum wage and competing with McDonald's this way, does that mean that the Chinese are taking over City Hall? Does it mean that the Chinese are taking over provincial parliament? Does it mean that the Chinese are taking over the Congress or the Senate or whatever the elected offices are in your country? I doubt it. Take a look at British Columbia's parliament or Canada's federal parliament or the American Senate or what have you. The fact that you have something visible in this way at this low level, it may be significant that some people like to eat Chinese food once in a while, but it neither means that the Chinese population is taking over the country, nor does it mean in another sense that white people are being taken over by Chinese culture. It really doesn't. And this comparison is sadly very meaningful for veganism. The fact that you have successful vegan restaurants doesn't even mean a significant percentage of their customers are vegan. It doesn't mean a significant percentage of their customers are becoming vegan. It can't be compared to adopting a new technology. It can't be compared to adopting a new culture or a new religion or anything else. It's just another niche in the free market competing with McDonald's, and where the same people who eat at a vegan restaurant once in a while may indeed be eating at McDonald's once in a while. I was thinking, I'm not going to get into it in this video in depth, but the delusion that veganism is a superior technology, I think it also rests on health claims that are shaky, that are weak. I wish I could tell you that the health benefits of veganism you only get by being a 100% principled vegan, but I think we all know it's not true. I've mentioned this before, at least I've mentioned before in conversation with my girlfriend, but I was at this school in Kunming, and there was an American guy, and he had basically switched from an American standard diet to a Chinese standard diet. I saw what he ate, because we were in the same school every day, so I saw what he ate for breakfast and lunch every day. He was eating meat 3 meals a day, but he had all the benefits of a vegan diet. I assume cheese had disappeared from his diet, and he switched from eating steaks and hamburgers to eating a typical Chinese-style diet where there are little bits and pieces of meat, so it's radically less meat. But all the stuff that the vegan doctors boast about, he was on high blood pressure medication, and he suddenly had to stop taking the high blood pressure medication. He had all these health conditions that were reversed, and he had to be taken off the medication. So if you've watched the monologues from different vegan doctors, they all boast about that. I wish it would be very convenient for me if you only got those health benefits from being an ideologically consistent, ethical vegan. But you don't. You can get those health benefits by eliminating dairy and cheese from your diet and by eating a reducitarian diet or what have you. So regarding this as a technology, again, instead you could just stop eating at McDonald's and start eating at the local Chinese restaurant or what have you. This is another element of this that is misleading. Now, finally, I appreciate that ModVegan mentions just one real-world example, which is Israel, of a country that has a high percentage of vegans, a significant vegan population. But even there, it would be really misleading to assume we're looking at an inevitable upward curve. What is the situation in Israel and what is the situation in Taiwan? So these are, I think, the two unique, important examples of societies that have a large percentage of people who've become vegan. In both Israel and Taiwan, there are extraordinary religious circumstances, extraordinary military and political circumstances, and even extraordinary ecological circumstances that have led a significant population to become vegan. Now, Israel is incredibly ethnically diverse internally. This is not just the division between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis, or between Palestinians and Jews, or what have you. Within the Jewish population, you're talking about Iranian Jews and North African Jews and Eastern European Jews and like British and American and French Jews. It is an incredibly internally diverse, fractious and fragmentary culture. It's very difficult to generalize and say that this could become a mass phenomenon within Israel. We have to be open to the possibility. We can't look at these examples with a can't-fail mentality. We have to be open to the possibility that it's already reached its maximum in Israel, or that it's even going to decline after hitting a peak, which is, of course, what happened with Hinduism and many of these other examples. But further, I don't think we could look at the example of Israel and say that these gains, this expansion of veganism, could be transferred from Israel to Egypt next door. Right away, if you say, so if this is the percentage of people who are vegan in Israel, don't you think in the next 5 years Egypt is going to catch up? Well, do you or don't you? How about Syria on the other border? Right away, just asking that question, we stop and think, actually there are a lot of really unique, really peculiar factors about Israel. Now, this includes the challenges. If you talk to Israelis about why so many Israelis have become vegan, there's a unique role for the kosher diet and Jewish dietary laws. And maybe we don't want to admit that to ourselves as vegans. Maybe we want to think, all of our fellow vegans are vegan for ethical reasons. As you know, a huge percentage of vegans are vegan because they got, the doctor told them they're going to have a heart attack if they don't change their diet. They're vegan for purely health reasons or what have you. Well, it may be hard to imagine if you haven't spent time around, Orthodox Jews or Jews who take those laws seriously. There really are Jewish people who became vegan because they found it a simpler way to live by Jewish dietary laws. Now, you can also, of course, meet Israeli Jews who've become vegan who have contempt for the kosher dietary laws. But believe me, this is an impossible to imagine for outsiders factor in terms of why so many Jews became vegan in Israel. And another factor is a very large percentage of Jews are lactose intolerant. So if you're someone who's struggling with Jewish dietary laws, you can't drink milk products anyway. Guess what, guys? That was the thin edge of the wedge for why veganism took off in a culture and in a religion that is actually completely hostile toward veganism. Now, meanwhile, in Taiwan, we're talking about a mixed Buddhist, Confucian, Chinese culture, but a culture where Buddhism is one major religious voice among many. Taiwan has I think, the largest and most vibrant vegan community, or vegan communities, plural, in the world. Okay, I think they're actually ahead of Israel. However, do you think that any of the gains made in Taiwan could be transferred to the Philippines? No chance. And the Philippines is divided between Catholics and Muslims at this point, right? Those are the next islands south. Look at a map. It's not that far. You can say, yeah, such a large percentage of people in Taiwan have become vegan. And, and this is the early adopter curve. This is the thin edge. So therefore, the next stop is the Philippines, right? This will take off. This will take off in all of Southeast Asia. You've got to be joking, all right? The extent to which Taiwan's veganism is based on Buddhist traditional culture. And I want to say this openly. For outsiders, this may be hard to imagine, but in the same sense that Jews, individual Jewish people, may be disillusioned with Judaism, may be disillusioned with the kosher diet, and therefore adopt veganism. In Taiwan, when I talk to serious vegan activists face-to-face, very often they were people disillusioned with Buddhism, disillusioned with what was going on in the religion, who became vegan for that reason. So it's not that they're such Orthodox Buddhists that they become vegan. Again, that wouldn't make any sense at all within Judaism. It's not like, you're such an Orthodox Jew, you choose to be vegan. But it's actually a sense of frustration with the religion not living up to its espoused goals. And in Taiwan, it was very often a feeling that Buddhism had become disengaged from the ecological struggle, but also from animal rights and other concerns, and seeing hypocrisy and corruption in Buddhism, and then veganism being an alternative that was not in those ways corrupt and what have you. So that's part of the kind of religious psychology of people adopting veganism in Taiwan. But one generation dies and is replaced by another. Everyone knows this in Taiwan. The new generation growing up is way less religious than the old generation on its way out. And the religion here we're talking about is Buddhism, miscellaneous, Confucianism, what have you. So It's entirely possible, we're not looking at the early adopter phase, that Taiwan is an example of a country that's maxing out about now with veganism, or even if it continues to grow a bit, that it will then decline because of these unique factors that led them to a high level of veganism. Guys, I think it is really dangerous to think with what's called a can't fail mentality. Veganism, from this perspective, I will go so far as to say veganism can fail and veganism will fail. What we have to plan for is not Gary Francione's fantasy of the number of vegans doubling every year and then taking over the country or taking over the whole world. Okay, that's not what we have to plan for. What we have to plan for is not ModVegan's fantasy that we're in the early adopter curve and we're going to become an absolute majority of the population in no time, in the same way that cellular phones there was an early adopter phase back when they were largely useless, and then they took over the whole population as they became, more functional, more affordable, et cetera, when they became more than just a status symbol for the wealthy. That was an early phase of phones that were like that. The type of failure we have to plan for is precisely that of being an ethically defined minority over the long term, of forming, of organizing effective modes of lobbying, effective ways of influencing the government, if long-term we may never do better than 2%, we may never do better than 1% in terms of people who are ethically motivated vegans. How to be effective, how to influence the future course of society, knowing that in a lot of ways we have less growth potential than some of these pathetic cult groups, transcendental meditation groups, or Scientology or something like this, because fundamentally we have a lot less to offer people. Yes, aside from saving the planet. I'm sorry to say, but that just doesn't motivate people the same way that, converting to a new religion and being promised immortal life after death, or being offered all the benefits of community and what have you that you get out of that. We don't have a lot to offer. We're not the new iPhone 10 or something. Veganism is not a technology that's offering to make your life easier. It's an ethical burden with very real political demands on your time and very uncertain, very dubious, future positive outcomes. So, with that being said, I love it. I'm in the movement long term myself, and I'm looking around saying, hey, who else is with me? ModVegan and I agree about a lot of things. I just want to put this as a caveat closing the video. The last time I talked to her, I pitched her a couple of ideas, including saying, look, within Canada, why don't we form a special lobbying group just on leather, something like PCRM. So PCRM is Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. They're lobbying in America on health issues linked to veganism, but we could have a specialized group just lobbying government and doing public education and outreach in schools and across the board, just dealing with leather. I think leather is an example of an obsolete technology. Leather has been made obsolete by progress of science, and now Nike shoes are just exhibited without leather and so on, and we can try to educate the public, hey, you know what? Leather actually contains chromium hexane. It's bad for your health. It's bad for the human health of the people involved in the manufacturing process. It's bad for the health of the cows that are tortured and suffer horribly. I think leather is a unique example where some of this technological thinking in terms of obsolescence, works, and it's a strong suit we can press forward on. However, I think of that from the perspective of someone who sees veganism as a failure, and as someone that's going to continue to fail, or we're going to continue to be a small, despised minority within Western society. 2% is optimistic, I think. But we're a small, despised minority that happens to be right about some of these issues, and where we can lobby, we can have our voices heard in a Western pluralistic democratic society, we can have big impacts. And there are tons of examples of tiny minorities who've had big impacts, and you can watch my videos about them. I think that's the strategic focus for how we need to move forward, and that any other notion of this being a new technology that's going to take over the mass market is ultimately a dangerous and self-defeating delusion.
À-bas-le-ciel.